True, true. All right, so let's do a little Kolchack action. Um, you again, you talk about in the book, and no big spoilers here, I hope. You talk about in the book about this gothic horror and how you really feel like Carl Kolchack is more termed. I think I'm going to get this wrong, but a gothic investigator or a gothic detective. Talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yeah, I think, from a genre history perspective, which is kind of, I guess, part of where I'm coming at this from, what is really innovative about Kolchack, and there's so much to love about the series, and there's so much to love about the movies, but what's really innovative was that recentering the story, not on the victim, not on the monster, but on the investigator, right? So that's the game changer in terms of horror on television. We certainly had horror on television, anthology series like Night Gallery and Twilight Zone. We'd had Dark Shadows, of course, Dan Curtis's earlier, the melodrama soap opera. We'd had, comedy horror. So we'd had The Munsters, we'd had The Addams Family, we'd had Bewitched, et cetera, et cetera. But all of those were kind of centered on either victims or monsters or some variation of them. Kolchack comes through, and it's actually not the first, it's actually kind of the second series to do this, but it's the one that's most successful, centers it on the investigator, on the monster hunter. And so you think about all of the horror television of the last, 20 years, it's been Buffy, it's X-Files, it's Supernatural, it's Twin Peaks, it's the Friday the 13th, the series. It's all centered on these, monster hunters. And that gothic investigator becomes kind of the pivotal thing that I think particularly works well on television. And I think that's what Kolchack really changed.
And going back to that too, I'm over here looking through notes and stuff. Constantine, one of the biggest people, I don't know if you saw the TV show, but in the DC universe, he's like that gothic detective. He I think he first made his appearance in a issue of Swamp Thing, I think in 1985 or somewhere around there in the 80s. And so, I mean, Constantine too is like here Constantine's, this occult investigator is looking for this swamp creature. I mean, and it's hard not to notice that, hey, one of the best episodes of Kolchack, even like 11 years prior, was the Spanish Moss Murders episode, which sort of saw Kolchack do this. So even in comic books, I feel like you get the we call it, I've heard it called getting the rub, or you get the that's more like a wrestling term. I don't know if you're familiar with the wrestling.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
But you get that little push that Kolchack sort of even influences comic books and stuff.
No, and Marvel Comics had a kind of parody issue that featured Kolchack. Kolchack-like characters appear in Batman and Howard the Duck and all kinds. Yeah, the influence of Kolchack, which is interesting for what is really a very short-lived series. I mean, it doesn't even go to its full series run. It kind of gets the plug pulled for all kinds of legitimately good reasons. For it to have sparked such long lasting, I mean, it did change television horror. Absolutely. It shows up in comic books. It shows up, of course, in novels. I mean, I think it really was a game changer. And that's what makes it so interesting. How did this relatively small, short-lived television series become this phenomena that even the people who maybe listen to this or see the book who've never heard of Kolchack, when they start reading, they'll say, oh, I know what that looks like. Like I have seen a version of that over and over and over again.
Yeah. The follow-up I was going to have to the Gothic question, sorry, I stepped out for a second, but I did a fair amount of studying in college with German language, German architecture, culture, those types of things. And I spent about 6 weeks in Germany back in '86. And I was actually there 3 days before Chernobyl happened, and was there in East Germany and we had to watch everything we ingested and all that stuff while we're there. But when we finally made it to Cologne, Germany, or Köln, K-O-L-N, if you're speaking German, and we saw the Köln Dome being restored, that being sort of the penultimate or the ultimate Gothic structure. And I always think of this dichotomy of Gothic, where it's this, soaring and reaching to high heights to show that you're closer to God, but then having just this nearly grotesque and certainly terrifying look about the structure, and then the types of things that you put on it with gargoyles or whatever else, that are on there. And it's that combination of those things. And then thinking about Kolchack being this Gothic investigator, or maybe you touched on this. If you did, I'm sorry, but that's the kind of thing that it really intrigues me so much about this air of Gothic. There's so much evil and wrong, but then at the same time, it heightens this awareness of potentially this other world and Christ and whatever else. Now, we can say it's all going to be Christian related. It could just be God for whatever God you have, and good and evil and that kind of stuff. But so when you think about Kolchack being Gothic in terms of the monsters, do you also think of it being Gothic in terms of like the architecture, the culture, and those types of things?
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I go back and think of like the root that makes that Gothic dome feel Gothic, to me, the root of Gothic is the otherworldly in this world.
Yes.
And so that's what those classic Gothic cathedrals, whether it's, wherever it is, but certainly Cologne is a great example. It just, the minute you look at it, or certainly when you enter it, you feel as if you stepped out of the busy market street into this other space. And so all the lines lift your eyes up, and everything looks amazing and otherworldly, and it's a different world in this world. And so if that's kind of the root of this, whether it's a novel that's about, Through the Looking Glass, or The Thing in the Basement, or The Thing in the Attic, or wherever the thing happens to be living, it's really about that intersection. Like, I'm in my normal world, and then suddenly I get a glimpse of this other world that's also here. And that is the heart of what Kolchack was about. And what I loved about Kolchack, and I write about this in the book, I think to me, one of the most innovative things that Kolchack brought to the table was the otherworldly is here, right? It's not in Transylvania in the 19th century. It's not in outer space. It's in an alleyway, right? It's in a taxi cab. It's renting a car in Las Vegas, right? It's at a sleep research center in Chicago. It's on a cruise ship, right? I mean, the places you go. And the other great thing about Kolchack was when those things happened, there are consequences. My favorite scene in the original Night Stalker movie from '72 is the moment when we see the woman who's died, our first victim, and then the camera angle flips, reverse shot. And so we're watching the doctors performing the autopsy, looking down at us. Because it reminds us, if a vampire killed someone in our world, the cops would come, the body would be investigated, there'd be an autopsy. Like, it wouldn't just be like in Dracula where someone dies and they go, I don't know. But here there would be legal procedures and medical forms and all that sort of. And Kolchack kind of took that otherworldly, supernatural Gothic narrative and really brought it into the mundane aspects of everyday life. And that's really scary.
Fantastic. Go ahead, Riley.
Oh, the funny thing about that too is like that happens during the opening credits, does it not? It has credits rolling over it.
Literally, the Night Stalker appears across them, all staring down, going, "Oh my, what's that?" Right?
Yeah,
it's great.
And I was going to talk about Gothic literature a little bit, or actually Southern Gothic literature is something I'm more familiar with, like Flannery O'Connor and stuff. And even in the world of the Southern Gothic, like it reminds me so much of Kolchack, because where's Gothic literature? I don't know, in my head, and maybe this is just me, I sort of equate that to taking place in some far off place and all this. But Flannery O'Connor, something like that, like a life you save, the life you save, maybe your own, I think was one of hers. Like that could happen here. And I think that's what happens with Kolchack. Like you read these stories, like, hey, this is not some different place. This is in our own backyard. And I think that's what Kolchack brought to television screens everywhere.
No, I think it's absolutely true. And if you look at, again, most of the horror narratives up into the 60s, so in the late 60s and about the time Kolchack is kind of being developed, it was always horror was over there, right? Over there might be outer space, over there might be Transylvania, over there might be, 100 years ago, but it was always like, you go out and you encounter it. But the films, I think Psycho is kind of the beginning of this cycle.
Yeah.
With Psycho, Hitchcock said, actually, the monster's not out there. He's next door. Like he's living with his mother by the motel, by the no longer used highway, right? So that, and then you look at like Night of the Living Dead, it's not like an alien invasion attack. It's like the real horror of Night of the Living Dead is us. Like we are the problem. Mm-hmm. And so I think Kolchack, as with Southern Gothic, that took that encounter with the other and recognized that in Southern culture, the other is here. It's in us. And we have been walking around it all the time. And so Kolchack really takes that and makes it. And I think this is what made the first two films so impressive. And the core of the series was that other is here. It's every day. You're walking by it. It's not, you don't have to go find a haunted house. And in fact, you notice there's no haunted houses. Like Kolchack's not out going to Amityville looking for that. He is at a fashion show. He's at a diamond sale. He's, it's like the most mundane everyday things. Kolchack says there might be something lurking, right, just behind what you think is normal.
Yeah, and just when you mentioned the scene of splitting away from the cutting away from the victim and then seeing the autopsy investigation, and then later through that episode, especially the infamous lines of dog, who said anything about a dog, when they talk about the dog bite, and it's those sort of sci-fi moments, brought into the horror show that I enjoy so much. And you think about, you say some things about the sort of the legacy of Kolchack and how it influences other shows. And I always think about, the funny thing is, Bradley, I don't know how much Buffy the Vampire Slayer you've watched, but they call themselves the Scooby Squad, because they're always investigating what's going on. So that's how they sort of proceed through to help the hero gather information and then go out and do battle. And of course, we've got, the X-Files and what they did with their investigation. But then past those two, you've got one of my favorite sci-fi shows, which is Fringe. And, it's all purely CSI, kind of investigation stuff with just a little bit of hero and interaction, mixed in. And I just love those combinations. And that's what really has always made me such a big fan of Kolchack, is you continue to have this as the investigative reporter. He has to continue to investigate. It's not just slasher scene after slasher scene after slasher scene. I mean, he has to interact with his people and his environment. And, everybody knows the structure. He's going to go back to INS at some point and fight with Tony. He's going to make fun of Ron, but those rare times Ron and Carl actually work together. And they make fun of Tony. And, the scene about when they say something that throws Tony on his ear. And the few times that Miss Emily takes Carl's side and does things, just love all that mixed into it. But I tell you what, let's make sure we don't forget. I've got the questions from Jeff that we've got here, and I've got those queued up on my phone. I'm going to see if we can play those correctly and or at least effectively. And then we'll do those.
Hey, while you're doing that, Robert, I might go ahead and jump in here because, we're talking about, and I think this is something that that you don't have to, everybody, I think that some people don't realize is that you don't have to, even something like Dracula, when it was written, people are like, oh, this is something new and fresh, but everything is referential to something else. You build upon everything. There's no wholly original idea, but even sometimes the outcome may not be, like, you may get to an outcome and people say, I don't see how you came to that outcome from coming from this, but you get there either way. Something like Stranger Things, which is probably the biggest show in the world right now, built upon Buffy, built upon even bits of, all this horror. I mean, if you've seen it, the last episode, there's a direct Halloween homage, it just is what it is. And and people think, oh, if you're not original, some people bash it for being unoriginal, but I think that stuff like that makes it even more enjoyable to me, is if you can see the references and people wear their influences on their sleeve. For the longest time, people wouldn't, because they felt like it would be, hey, I'm copying this or that. But I think we're entered a time now where it's okay to be like, hey, this is what I love and this is what this is based off of. And I'm proud to say it is, I'll show it.